analogy back up.
Jesus incarnation.
It forces the mind to be creative.
Yeah, just on a different path.
We completely disregard everything they've ever said or done as a result of that.
Right, so we've been doing this series for those of you who haven't been here for the rest of it, where we've been looking at the mental health and personality of Bible characters.
Okay.
And so we've looked at David in the past, we've looked at Saul, and now we're looking at Samson. So
Yep. Awesome.
we typically start by looking at their story and moving through it in that way. So let's start there.
And let's start with the story of how it's before he came to happen, because there is not many characters in the Bible that we have a storyline before. Like we have examples of Samuel, we know what happened beforehand. With the mom story, the Hannah. But Samson is one of those that we know behind the scenes before gestation. And I think that tells us a lot about him. So what do we know? Angel came to mom, the angel of the Lord, which happens to be Jesus.
Yeah.
According to some theologians, which I'm not, but the angel of the Lord comes, talks to the mom, who I believe we don't have the name, and says, you're going to have a son, and gives her a little bit of ruling. So he said, hey, you don't drink alcohol and all that kind of stuff. I just want to make a bracket of how amazing this story is and how amazing God is, because he's given some health tips for people who are going to be pregnant. Obviously, there's a special thing that Samson was going to go on to, and we'll probably talk about that. But
It's good advice anyway.
yeah, absolutely. Avoiding alcohol fetal syndrome. It's not a bad thing. Sorry. So yeah, and then it repeats the story to Dad, because Dad was a bit of an unbeliever. He's like, you're barren. I mean, how are you gonna have a child? And the same story repeats, and that will be a good starter of understanding Samson, because the angel of the Lord, as the story says that he was gonna be a Nazarite. That's one thing, and I think it would be a good idea to know what that means. But two, the story of Samson is found in the Bible in the book of Judges, which implies that he's a judge. So you have two high calls in there. He was going to be a pastor and an elder. I don't know if that makes any sense, but yeah. Does that make some sense?
His life already had great purpose and meaning before he even created that, right?
Yes.
Like, often people's the purpose they have is like they have a dream, something they want to accomplish or whatever, and that gives them purpose and drive to go ahead. Whereas he was born into purpose.
Correct.
So, which would have, I imagine, that would have set him up with a very certain or very particular way of thinking about his own value as well.
Yeah. 100%. And sometimes we forget that, and I think that's important to understand. When we understand Samson's personality and way of doing things, that context must be ever present. If I were to ask us in the table, when you think of Samson, what do you think?
Strong and weak.
He's strong and weak, okay.
Yeah.
Physically strong, weak. What?
He had a weakness.
Okay.
As in
Only one, or
no, I suppose not only one, but the one that's so prominent is lust.
okay, lustful. Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe morally weak.
Yeah, that's probably a good way of putting it.
Is that what you guys think? I don't know.
I always think of him as a very passionate person, right? Like, he's very moved by emotion and not necessarily reason.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when I think of Samson, I think about the Hulk of the Bible, right? Like,
Yeah.
but good looking.
Yeah, he's not all green. So.
Right, yeah. I'm not encouraging people to go and see the Hulk, but the Hulk is ugly. It's meant to. Yeah. But this guy is strong, good looking. A lot of things are going on for him, I think. And with that comes responsibility. And you're right. I think there is this aspect of passion and emotion coming to life in his life. I don't know, Ben, what do you reckon in terms of what do you think when you think of Samson?
Yeah, it's definitely his strength, and of course his weakness to women. So yeah, he's lost. So
okay, cool.
But yeah, it's also interesting because he flies off the handle a few times too. Like you said, over his passion.
Yeah, yeah. So eventually he's born, right? And then what is one of the first things that we know about him?
Yeah. Samson is born, verse 24 and 25 of Judges 13. Immediately once you get to Judges 14.
Yep.
So where he's born, and then we're 3 verses in, he's already chasing a Philistine woman.
Yeah. And
Let's hope there were some years in between.
yeah. And I assume he wasn't 10, 11, 12. I mean,
Yeah.
he will have been a little bit older.
Yeah.
So obviously we don't have a lot of information there. But maybe we can dissect a couple of characteristics of what his life might have been like in his environment. But yeah, you're right. He's suddenly chasing this person who maybe he shouldn't have been chasing either way.
Even look at the way that it frames it. In verse 2, so he went up and told his father and mother, saying, I've seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now, therefore, get her for me as a wife. I mean, like, I'm sorry, but
What would you do if one of your sons said that to you?
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I'm sure there is some cultural differences here that are perhaps silent, but really, I don't think that I would think that was a normal thing, for one of my boys to come and ask me that. And I certainly can't see my parents responding well to that if I have come to them at the age of 18 and said, hey, by the way, this is what I want you to do for me. And so I think it seems that he's dictating what's happening, right?
Yeah.
He seems to be in the position of control at this point of the story.
Yeah. And his parents are like, hey, is there no other women around?
Yeah.
The interesting thing in the passage is that the Bible almost says that Samson had been planning this. So far it's like, the Bible says that the parents did not know that this was in Samson's given by the Lord so that he can go and have some revenge against the Philistines. Because if you go the chapters before Samson existed, it talks about how Israel was having been oppressed, so was under the dominion of the Philistines.
Yep.
So Samson is seeking this opportunity. So far so good. Hey, you're making like a bit of a theater there. It sounds wrong though, but we could justify it.
Yeah.
Well,
Maybe.
Yeah. When you keep reading from where Luke finished up, there's a little bit of pushback from the mother and father.
Yes.
Yeah, as you were just saying. And Samson's response is quite indicative there. It says, get her for me because she pleases me well. So as you said, like there was obviously some observation that had taken place. It was sort of a premeditated thing for Samson.
Yeah. It was indeed. And so he eventually, I mean, this does a little bit of parents. We're talking behind the scenes about that, but the parent seems to just give in.
Yeah.
So
Do you think that was because he was Hulk?
he was scared of his own son. Maybe. Maybe they were just consequential. They were just the boundaries were not there. I don't know. I mean, it's a hard position for a parent, though.
Yeah, I was going just to put
It's a hard
yourself in
position.
their shoes, though. So there's a child that is miraculously born to you. You know that he is going to have some great place in Israel, and your understanding of Israel being this conduit through which the Messiah was going to come. You've got this sense of importance of the race that you're in, and an angel has come to you and told you that you're going to have a child and he's going to have this important role in that. You're going to be looking at that child not like, there's the potential anyway for you not to be looking at the child like, well, you are someone that I need to train, but you are going to bring salvation to us. And if there is
like
that so if there is that inversion, then they may be giving him a very loose rein.
Yeah, it is potential. Now that you mentioned that, it makes me think that you remember everybody in Israel, before Israel, everyone from the time of Adam will be thinking that their son could be the redeemer of the world.
Yes.
Maybe this is the guy. Who knows? You just brought that to my attention. I never thought of that. It could be that this is the guy.
I think that is faulty thinking, though.
Wouldn't you want him to be better, though?
Yeah, well, I mean,
exactly.
they all they had to do was review their history and see how Moses' parents or his mum, treated that responsibility of seeing greatness in Moses and therefore, taking the opportunity to train him well. Like that would have been the better response to that, thought process that you were describing there, Luke, of him being a special child. Therefore, invest lots into him rather than just backing off.
Yeah.
I mean, worst case scenario, they could have said no, and then he goes and does whatever he wants. And that's what brings us back to Samson and his personality. There is a conflict in here, I believe. Because on the one side, he's going for a woman that he know he should not have a place with. just because it pleased him to the eye,
Mm-hmm.
which goes back to that idea of lust that you mentioned, David.
Mm-hmm.
But he wasn't only that, he was conflicted because he went back to ask mommy and daddy for permission.
Mm-hmm.
Makes no sense. Strong, I mean, big, handsome, buffed up guy going like, hey, can you please go and ask for this girl for me? Makes absolutely no sense. So it was within the tradition, and he respected that, but he's not respecting the fact that he's going with a pagan woman.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There is this, and I think that's what I start to see here in this story of this guy as we think of him as, I don't know, profile him or whatever you want to call it, but is the dichotomy, the incongruency, and we touched a little bit in one of the episodes before, that cognitive dissonance, where you believe something, but you do something different. It brings severe trouble to people. And I think as we go through the story, we'll see that it wasn't the only time he had that.
Can we just go back as well to what we were discussing about maybe there being an element of fear involved here for Samson's parents? Yeah.
Okay.
If that is the case, and I'm not saying that it is, but just theoretically, if that were to be the case, that would potentially indicate that these outbursts that I think you spoke of, Ben, in Samson's life might not have been begun when we see the record. Like that,
From childhood.
this could have been something that had been right throughout his childhood, which might indicate that he wasn't the parenting wasn't necessarily that great, or that he had this sort of maybe anger management issues for some time before this.
Yeah. There is something that definitely happened. We can go here to the science where we are genetically loaded with certain tendencies, but they don't have to be polished, exploited, or practiced. So you might be right. I mean, he might have this tendency of being more choleric. We talk about temperaments: choleric, melancholic, sanguine, phlegmatic. Choleric, more and more quick to rise to anger.
Okay.
But somebody with such tendencies doesn't have to necessarily express them and manifest them. So maybe he wasn't given discipline, or discipline meaning teaching, correction, and discipline can be good, positive as well as undesirable, and he manifested in this. Definitely the parents say, hey, there is other options. Can you see a daughter somewhere else? And he's like, no, this is the one. Like, yeah, okay. Bottom line, if you forward a little bit, he married this lady. And what happened then?
Didn't go so well.
Right? So he marries this lady. He does this feast. And then before that happens, though, he kills his lion. And I think that's a non-story by many. Like, he kills the lion. Yeah. And then as he goes back to the lion, or passes back, what does he find?
Honey.
And what does he do?
Makes a riddle.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I'll come back to the. He makes a riddle, and then he said, hey, there's this riddle, and I don't remember how the riddle goes, but basically the answer was honey and lion. What's sweeter than honey, and what's stronger, or something like that, than the lion? Yeah. The wife is oppressed. He gets oppressed by blackmail, and we're gonna kill you and your household, your parents, and everybody in your family if you don't tell us what the riddle is. The lady comes and whinges to Samson, and henceforth his weakness. He's like, okay, I'm gonna tell you because I cannot. And that's a lesson for a lot of men these days. And this is not a men thing. And I don't want men to listen and watch to this to feel like that. But we have historically been very weak to the enticements of our spouses or partners, which is an interesting thing. It tells us a little bit about from Adam. If we're talking about just Christianity from the Bible, like from Adam, like he was like from there. So the pressure was too much. He gave in. And anyhow, it was an opportunity. That's when Samson then goes out, and he gets so angry, so rushed, and he doesn't have control over anything of his emotions. And he gathers these animals, and he puts the tails together, and then he puts fire, and then he wipes the whole thing.
It sends the foxes throughout their
through
crops.
the fields, and he burns everything. And
300 of them.
Actually, that was after they gave his his wife to somebody else. I
Yeah,
think.
yeah, and then his father-in-law said, "Well,
There's another one.
she's gone, but she's got a younger sister."
And apparently it was more beautiful.
Yeah.
According to the father-in-law, he's like, look, this one is prettier. He's like, no, I want that one.
Mm.
So you can imagine like a 3-year-old mentality in this massive body.
Yeah.
Like, I want this one. Like the little kid wanting the chocolate and making a big deal out of it. Obviously, it's a big thing. It's his wife.
Yeah,
So-
you can understand why he's
Yeah,
angry.
that's right. You cannot blame the guy if you want to call it. But from there to do this thing, it's an interesting thing.
And also the degree of 'cause, yes, we talked about him being a passionate man and with anger management issues. Yeah. But this is for a sustained period. How long would it take you to assemble 300 foxes? You know, like
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
is not the kind of thing that you just it's done. Yeah, exactly.
Just half an afternoon.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's a big deal. This is premeditated retributive justice that he's trying to do here.
So I think what we 100% and what we see in Samson is somebody who hasn't practiced, who has been living a life of indulgence, self-indulgence, no restraint, because hey, nobody was in front of him to tell him, hey, you cannot do it. Like, okay, you want to tell me, I'm not gonna do what I wanted to do. He was the Hulk.
Who's going to stop me?
Yeah. So he had no restraint whatsoever. He was self-indulgent, and I don't think delayed gratification was in his language, right?
I want it now.
Yeah. You guys seen the Marshmallow Experiment
Yes.
from
Yeah,
Stanford
yeah.
University
Yeah.
from back in the 1960s and
Oh, yeah.
70s? Now they keep on doing the whole thing, and I think if you gave a marshmallow to this guy, he will just eat it.
Yeah.
Before he got the instructions.
100%. Yeah. For those people who don't have a clue what we're talking about, just Google it. YouTube Marshmallow Experiment.
Yeah.
And scientifically speaking, we know that people who eat the marshmallow and don't wait for a second marshmallow don't tend to finish things, are less successful in life. Relationships are poorer. It's not a good thing, right? So, and that's a key for when we go to resolution. I think that's a key factor in there. But that's the tendency of this guy. That's a tendency of Samson, and that's part of his trait, his personality. The other thing that, going back to that idea of cognitive dissonance and going back to the lion, which I said like, no, but yes, it's a good point, is that when he came back to the lion, he found the honey, we already talked about, and he ate it. Now we have to remember one thing, Nazarites were not meant to, matter of fact, Hebrew people were not meant to touch carcasses.
Yeah.
A Nazarite couldn't even go and touch the grave of their parents. So this guy is going against everything that was part of his identity. Right. So he had this identity, and he just violated his identity by going with somebody who wasn't who was of an equal yoke, like people talking Christianity, like somebody has nothing to do with his faith. And two, he is violating one of the main cores of his identity as a Nazarite, as a judge, as somebody. Nazar is from the idea of consecrated, separated. He was meant to be a special guy. Henceforth, he's a judge. Funny enough, even though he's going through these rushes, he is still judging the Philistines, right? Because he's meant to judge. He's judging the people amongst the people. So he was like, hey, the wise guy amongst the people. I don't know how much wisdom this guy has.
Yeah.
He's meant to be doing the, hey, you come like Solomon, 2 women with the child, and like, okay, let me tell you. He probably would. I'll kill both. And I don't know how he will have judged. He judged for 20 years. The Bible says so. Either the people.
So did he do more damage in his judgments of the people or in his flashes of anger? Wow.
Well, he definitely wasn't a good example.
But I never thought about it like that, because when you put that into context, if you've got somebody who can't themselves handle delayed gratification, or like looking at the bigger picture, or managing their emotions and all the rest of it, and you're going to them to deal with the most serious matters in Israelite society.
You want to hope you get them on a good day.
It just makes you wonder.
Yeah.
Or is it a case of do as I do, not as I say? Do as I say, not as I do. So
I suspect
like
that might be
Pharisaic
the
thing.
Yeah, because you don't hear about his judgments here. So I wonder if his judgments were really bad, would we have seen them more? So I would take the guess and say that perhaps they were fairly routine. So he may not have done a bad job at all with his judgments.
But he just could not apply the principles in his own life.
To his own life.
Well, it's easier to see the problems in other people's lives than your own.
You're 100% right, man. Actually, it's easy for us to criticize else than ours. Yeah, it's a very big possibility. I don't know. I can imagine, because of his last problem. Imagine, coming with, hey, there is this woman that I want to marry, but then the parents don't want to give him to me for a bride, and I already prepared the house, and they say yes, and and he looks at her like, well, she looks pretty. Look, you cannot have him, and he has him for himself. And who is gonna say no? Nobody again. Anyhow, we're extrapolating, making a lot of assumptions, but it's not hard to see that. It is not hard to see this tendency because of his doings.
Can I just ask you a question? You're saying about Samson not really accepting his identity, or the God-given identity. So he had therefore sort of accepted or chosen a different identity for himself. What do you think the identity that Samson chose was?
Well, I don't know what the identity he chose was, but it was one against the one. We know the one that was the original. I don't know. I don't know if you mean a personality, but identity is different than a personality. It's not that he was fully against his identity. He was just conflicted, right? That's what I was trying to say. He had this conflict where he was he was still judging, because the Bible says 20 years. We already talked about that. So he's still doing his job. But then he's conflicted with the desires of his flesh, with his lusts, with his immediate gratification, with his whatever, with his rage and anger. He couldn't control his anger management issues. So there was that dissonance. I'm going to church, but when I'm out of church, I do all sorts of wild things that don't make sense with my church life. And that's the dissonance, I think. Okay. So I don't know. Do you think of having an identity of else, like maybe a medium term, trying to be the balanced Christian?
That's an interesting thought. No, I was thinking more along the lines of sometimes we can choose to I guess see our identity in the strengths that God has given us, rather than in our identity that God has given us. And so I wonder whether Samson was doing a bit of that, like he was seeing himself as, I am this, right? Whereas really that was just one thing that God gave him in order to fulfill his identity.
I am the muscle bag judge, not I am a child of God.
Right. Because it seems that he let his strength rule him in a sense.
And
that was just his way of getting what he wanted all the time, like you were saying.
100%. It could very much be. I still can think of people today, when you think of it, who struggle with anger management issues and who are not strong at all. I mean, when I think about the gift, that's an interesting one of thinking, Dave, because I think of, we do form an identity sometimes based on our talents and our gifts given by God. And I might not think that might be necessarily wrong. I think the issue here was that he was he didn't have control over these gifts. So let's imagine it's not a strength and sheer physical power, but let's imagine that we have a gift to, I don't know.
Discernment,
and he can use it to be the best in cryptocurrency buying and stock market exchanges. Right, and be a millionaire for self.
Right.
Versus use it for what God intended it. So.
Or become famous among the land and get 1,000 wives.
Funny you mentioned Solomon, because there is intricacies with this. There is no intricacies. There is convergences and parallels to Solomon's life. When I reflect on Samson and Solomon, Solomon says, anything under the sun I try. If I liked it, I had it. It wouldn't be hard for me. I preached a sermon once on a presentation actually on suicide, because and it was about Solomon, because Solomon became suicidal at some point. That's another figure, I guess, but because he lost pleasure for anything, and so he says, and it's not hard to think that Solomon will have even try all sorts of substances. of his time. Opioids, alcohol, for example, is very strong drinks that we might not even have. And he didn't restrain himself for any wants. And lust obviously was an issue. Sometimes we always justify, it was to do with an arranged marriage, a political, and it's true. But out of all of those 1,000, there will be a lot. The concubines wouldn't. I don't know if the concubines will be arranged things. Maybe they were. I don't know. But there will be a lot of lust and sexual perversion of some kind. He saw it, and I wanted it.
Yeah.
And Samson had the same thing.
Yeah.
Because nothing was stopping him from getting whatever he wanted.
Right. And just to talk on what you were saying there about substance abuse, whether or not there was substance abuse, even in what we're seeing in Samson and in Solomon with regard to lust and these maybe illicit sometimes relationships, there's still, it's in a form, it is kind of in a form a substance abuse in itself, right? Because you're getting that same chemical release.
It's a drug.
Yeah.
It's an addiction.
Yes.
It's an addiction.
So let me ask this question, and I feel like it's an obvious question, but I also feel like it's informative to this part of the discussion. But what is wrong? What are the negative effects that one might experience by getting what they want all the time?
Good question. So what is a negative experience from getting what they want all the time? Well, I don't know what you think about it, but there is a lot of things that I desire that might not be good for me.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think that on its own premise, it's a dangerous thing. I think I mentioned this in an episode before. They're not like, or was it behind the scenes? That I do believe that God hasn't made me a millionaire because I know that I wouldn't be
A good steward.
Not a good steward. A very, very, very poor steward. Yeah. And I might get in trouble because of that.
Yeah.
For all sorts of reasons, So God knows what we need, but that's not part of the question. But I do think that if we get everything that we want, it will be disastrous. Yeah. Because we have this tendency to also satisfy self. So it's
so the more capacity we have, the more likely we are to expend it on ourselves.
Yeah.
In any vertical, right? It doesn't matter whether that's substance or lust or greed or whatever it is. Whatever it is never going to be enough.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing is that we become dissatisfied. And that's what happened to Solomon. You become dissatisfied, which not switching to Solomon a little bit, but we become dissatisfied with what we have. Yeah. If getting everything what we want were to occur, at some point in time we have everything, which happened to Solomon, and we will start having no thrive, no reason for living.
It's the hedonistic curve, right?
Yeah. So when we talk about just bucket lists, fast forward thinking, I want something in life. Hey, I want to work towards something to look forward to. Once you have everything that you want, there is no such a thing. You lose the drive to live. Even you couldn't even utilize it as a good ministry thing, like I'm going to evangelize people, and you're evangelizing right, left, and as soon as you talk to somebody, they get dunked in the baptism pond. Yeah. And you're like, everything that I have happens. There is no desire, no drive, there is no chemical. You talk about that chemical. There is no chemical in your brain that will come. And that's as humans, because when I think about this, I think about the parallel of God, who, you could argue he can have whatever he wants, but then he has this freedom, and that probably becomes a bit more a philosophical, complex matter to talk about. But we are human beings who are limited by the structures that we have in our brain, in our emotions, in the chemistry level as well. So I think there's dangers with just have whatever you want. Yeah. And the moment that you find that you cannot have it, what's going to happen then? Which is what happened to Samson. Yeah. If I cannot have it, trouble comes. Yeah. I'm going to round everybody up, and I'm going to burn the plantations and do whatever I need to do because you are denying me from what I want.
And something interesting that I find about Samson is how little that he learns, right? Like, he had this experience that we've just been talking about, and I was looking in the Bible, like just into chapter 16. Now Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there and went into her, And here starts the story of Samson and Delilah, which is potentially the most well-known part of his story.
Yeah.
And but a similar thing again. They want to know the secret of his strength, and she questions him, and eventually, after much back and forth, gets the secret out of him. But of course, with the purpose of cutting his hair and taking his strength and imprisoning him.
Mhm.
So
100%.
he
Yeah.
finds himself basically in a worse position than he ever was before, falling to the same thing that he fell to last time.
And you see again that inability to restrain. I mean, going to a prostitute in the middle during the day, people wanting to kill him. He knows, and this is the interest. Sometimes obviously I'm not God, so I do not fully understand how God works His purposes. But through this process, Samson keeps on judging the Philistines in his mistakes. Just before that, he killed with a jawbone of a donkey 1,000 of the Philistines, making judgments because of his anger, which is fascinating to me. And that will be probably more about the character of God and how he does his purposes than the Samson business. But you're right. So he goes to a prostitute, obviously, because he's still full of these lustful, desireful things, and then he runs away, and then you have the Delilah thing, and that's when we have another cognitive dissonant thing between his Nazarite judging or judge position with what he did, and what we know is that he fell asleep, and he didn't just fall asleep for the sake of falling asleep. It's he was consuming substances that he probably shouldn't be consuming either. So a Nazarite, one thing, the carcasses shouldn't be touched. There were 3 vows for the Nazarite in his case. One is he shouldn't cut his hair. 2, carcasses shouldn't be touched because you are pure, sacred, consecrated, separated. And 3, you shouldn't be drinking alcohol. Henceforth, the mom wasn't drinking alcohol from the womb. It wasn't just about his health. It was because these guys consecrated. And all of the 3 things he violated because he forgot his identity. He forgot who he really was. He forgot who he was meant to be. He forgot who he was appointed to be. And I think that happens a lot to us. I mean, from the very core of our existence, this is sidetracking a little bit, but when we forget, for example, that we are actually designed, for example, there is a problem. When we say, hey, we came from the monkey and we evolved, and we came from the amoeba, and the amoeba became an amphibian, and the amphibian became whatever, we start losing relevance, significance, we start losing meaning, worth, if you want to call it. So that's what happened to Samson. And so he's making these foolish decisions against who he knew he should be. And again, the dissonance is very clear, at least in my mind, because he's going to mom and dad say, please get us a wife. He's following the traditions. 2, he's still judging. Good or bad, we don't know. We make assumptions. But he's still, for 20 years, he's judging, which means he's still doing his job. And he knows he has to do it. But on the opposite, he's doing everything else that maybe he shouldn't be doing. Or not maybe, that we know. That he knew, that he himself knew he shouldn't be doing.
He was convicted on.
Yeah. And so what happens then? You mentioned his hair gets cut.
Yeah. And he's taken captive.
Yeah. And then they make him an exhibit. And we don't know much about how many years, how long, how many weeks, months. I suspect it will have been at least months.
It would have to be, because we're
'cause of
talking
his
about
hair growing back.
his hair,
Yeah. I have been shaved. I don't know how many of you. And I know how long it takes for hair to grow. I don't know. He has some. Back then, maybe they have more, I don't know, more original genetic material. So maybe the hair grow quicker. and those of us who don't have much hair either, it might grow less quick. But I don't know. I will say, I don't know how long is long for a Nazarite. Shoulder length. It will take a little bit of time. It will take a little bit of time.
Like in my head, like again, I was thinking like it would have to get to a certain length. So I'm thinking like at least a year. But who knows?
Yeah.
But it's irrelevant. It take a long time. Like that's the point. Right?
Yeah, for sure. So, and that's where the end of Samson comes. And the end of Samson is an interesting one as well, because he is seeking revenge. Nothing changed from his personality and his doings. Whenever he did the fire in the plantation with the foxes, it was revenge. Whenever he did the jawbone thing, it was revenge. Whenever he took the door on his shoulders. He was, I know they want to
Yeah.
kill me, so I'm gonna take this massive door and see how they're gonna have 1,000 men bringing it back. I don't know. It was all revenge. He was full of this resentment, and I don't know. You have to wonder whether the revenge was for God's sake, and we know that it wasn't, because it was about my wife, my riddle, my money I'm gonna be losing, my something.
Yeah.
And now he's trying to. The Bible says clearly that he's praying to God.
Yeah.
And the amazing thing is, God grants him this thing.
Yeah.
He helped me to revenge my eyes.
Yeah.
Because they pluck him, and make him blind. They pluck them out.
Yeah.
And again, the dissonance is in here, because I don't know, you guys, if you pray today, hey Lord, help me so that when I get out of this place, my car is not anymore the car I drive. It's gonna be the Ultra something. I don't know, whatever
Tesla.
car you think. A Tesla. And I get out, and I truly sure that it's gonna be a Tesla, right? Most of us wouldn't. No, that's never gonna happen. But this guy prayed, and he's like, okay, take me to this pillar.
Yeah.
Or he was in the pillars before. Either way, but he starts squeezing this thing. I can imagine him either pushing or grabbing. I don't know how it was. But he did it in faith. We could argue, he already felt the strength. But the Bible is clear that it's the strength of the Lord that came to him. So he had to believe it.
Mm-hmm.
He had to. His faith never left him, in a way. And that scares me, though.
It scares you? Wouldn't that encourage you?
Yes and no. It scares me to think that we can be in church and at the same time not. So we can have this cognitive dissonance. And the reason why it scares me is because it's not hard to fall into this dissonance. And one of the things that come to my mind is when dissonance comes, I mentioned this in a previous episode, it's one of the factors for people who, when they're hopeless, get more driven to taking their own lives. When you feel this guilt and this shame to know that I should not be doing this, but I'm doing it, and I'm doing it over and over, and I cannot help myself. That scares me. That's the part that scares me. It encouraged me to think of what it says about whom God is, for sure. Which is loving, kind, merciful, graceful, listening to him in his despair. I don't know what your thoughts are, but then the question really comes, and this is something that has been debated, and there is papers literally in schools of behavioral science, theology, and psychology about whether Samson suicide.
Yeah.
But I don't know. What do you think so far about Samson's life, personality, doings?
I wrote down he was irrational.
Okay. Logically rational, right? Or because he was emotionally driven.
Yeah, that's right.
And what is the danger of being more emotionally driven?
Well, I think as you were maybe alluding to before, like when you're living without any degree of temperance, you're led about by your desires. And the Bible says clearly that our heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. And so we can't trust entirely to our innate desires. So that's going to lead us in places that God wouldn't have us go, right? That wouldn't be compatible with our identity. So yeah, so to me, I think that's the danger.
Okay. Yeah, 100%.
I think it's interesting that you were saying that it scares you to see his experience there, and the fact I was thinking about in Hebrews, right? We're in chapter 11 where it talks about the hall of faith, where it talks about all these people, and he makes mention of the judges and mentions Samson by name, and it says who, after it lists them, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, and stopped the mouths of lions. Like that's some of that is direct allusion to stuff that Samson did, right?
I think that it speaks about who God is.
Yes,
right,
and I agree.
That's the hope.
I agree, but the thing that I find interesting is that he was still utilized.
Yeah,
right?
100%.
And so, for me, when I see his story, I take great courage from it because I feel that it is assuring to know that he could still be used by God, even though he himself had weaknesses. And that gives me courage that
Mhm.
my weaknesses are not stopping me from being used by God. The challenge, I think, comes on the flip side of that when we think, well, that may be true, but how much good could he have done if he was willing to address these issues that were obvious in his character? If he had have worked on those and allowed God to work with him, his ministry surely would have been a far greater one.
Mhm.
And so I think on one side we can take courage from his experience, but on the other side I think it's a cautionary tale that if we truly want to commit ourselves to God, we need to be willing to do the hard stuff and examine our own hearts, be aware, acknowledge who we are and what we're going through, and then seek that help on the other side. With God, work through it, do the hard thing. A lot of people don't want to do the hard thing to get onto the other side of whatever the issue might be.
And I think that happened, as you mentioned, that unfortunately it did happen to him, but he did a lot of great good with what he had. So our flaws in character sometimes are overseen or I don't know if call it ignore, but let him go by God for his glory, for his purpose, and to give us opportunities. Interestingly enough, as he dies, he continues to judge the Philistines, and for the benefit of the people of God. I propose, in my mind, as I have reflected on this character, I propose that I don't think he suicided because he didn't die hopeless. Maybe he was hopeless, like nothing is gonna go, but I think he died with the hope that, God, you will listen to me because you've done it before, and he prayed in faith and say, okay, this is it. This is the last thing I'm gonna do. Yes, driven by his own revenge, which tells us something. Let's not be driven by revenge. It can send us to death. But he died with this faith and hope that God will listen, and he acted on that, and that was the last thing we know of him.
So are you saying that Samson was a martyr?
Well, by revenge he was. There's a few options. Either he suicided, or he did something that we call suicide murder.
Okay.
Or he didn't, and he just, I don't know, you call it a martyr, but maybe by revenge. The conflict is the revenge.
Yeah, it's the motive
revenge
that's the problem, right?
in my eyes.
Yeah.
That's with the conflict. I don't think that can be solved. And in this, but he died for a purpose.
Yeah.
And a good cause. It wasn't like a hopeless, helpless depression. If anything, he might have been angry. Or he said, Lord, just listen to me one last time.
Yeah.
One last time. And that's faith.
Yeah.
Would you say Jesus was a martyr?
Yeah.
Jesus. Yes.
Yeah. So
I think another thing, it's very hard, I think, to sometimes speak into the world that they were in, right? Without seeing it and living it and understanding the culture. But what I was just reading that section where it says, verse 28, then Samson called to the Lord, saying, O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. I guess the real question that it hinges on is he saying from just a purely revenge-focused, I want them to pay for removing my sight? Or is that, or was he saying that as the expression of the ultimate picture of them oppressing Israel, taking him captive, and going through that process? Is he meaning that that's the representation, that's what he went through? But is it the bigger picture of he's asking God to strengthen him so he can bring vengeance on them, not just for what has been done to him, but also for their oppression of him and God's people? I don't know. He's saying it clearly, but I do wonder whether in his mind, is it that, or is he seeing the bigger thing that the Philistines are responsible for, and that's what he's speaking to?
It's hard to tell, but given that most of the things we know about him judging the people, it's usually in this despair. We could argue that he might justify. Actually, the beginning, the first story line, when he's asking for the first wife, for that wife, and the Bible is clear saying, but the parents did not know that Samson did this to mess up the Philistines. Tells us that he had a bit of a twisted mind in there, but God used it. He wasn't a smart guy, but the problem was his self-control. So maybe he had the double-edged purpose. God, my eyes, but let's just. And the Bible is clear. He killed more Philistines than in his whole life, and that would have been a lot. Like heaps. So. I think that there is. It's not unreasonable to think that.
my only reason
Unlikely, though, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Just because, given the trajectory of his life.
Yeah, and
Or
I
the way
agree.
he makes decisions.
Yeah.
I agree with that. The main reason I was asking the question is because it is labelled as, a faithful, like he
Faithful
was
guy, yeah.
labelled as a faithful guy, and that I was trying to find ways to interpret that into the story, but I agree that it doesn't seem the most likely scenario. I was just exploring it, but I'm curious.
Maybe works do count. That's a different topic, isn't it? But James talks about that. But anyhow, that's more theological. Look, if I were to see somebody like Samson in my clinic, I will think that one of the first things that we need to think of is the trajectory of that anger and lack of self-control.
Yeah.
And that goes back to, we started talking about this, it goes back to childhood. It goes back to childhood. It goes back to, do I have to be dictated by the way things were during my first years of development? Sometimes psychologists do that. They go back, and sometimes there's a bit of a little purpose, but the purpose is not to go just to explore and be curious, but rather to be able to process and understand, why am I doing what I'm doing today right now, right? And so that understanding can then be utilized for good. You say, hey, you understand that this happened because of the way things were around your home, and you were a precious child, and you were a child of God, and they were protected you because you were, to me, sacred and consecrated, and then they allow you to do whatever you want because your parents messed up. I don't know. And then he's like, oh, so that's the reason why I'm very angry. That's the reason why I want to do whatever I want. And then he has a choice, because that's what awareness brings. If you don't have awareness, you don't have choice. So awareness or insight, we talked about in previous episodes, brings choice. That's one thing. And the second thing is thinking about this dissonance, cognitive dissonance. The idea that are you going through this process of believing this and doing this, which is opposing to your identity. Yeah. And the last thing which we talked during the episode is, let's practice self-restraint. Let's practice this delay gratification. And that can be very practically done. It's one of the skills that can be done with people who have anger management issues. From very simple things such as, hey, you're going to buy a chocolate. I want you to just eat one square, leave the rest in the fridge or in the pantry. Like, that only works if you are the kind of person who eats the whole thing.
Yeah.
If you are not, then it makes no difference. Because you're so
basically you need to find where you naturally desire and then counteract it, right?
Yeah, but don't try to practice your self-restraint when you are, if you are having a domestically violent relationship and you are the perpetrator, don't try to, I'm going to try and practice restraint and see what happens. You practice in other areas. At that point in time, you probably shouldn't be with that person you're violating because you are dangerous. You need to remove yourself for the sake of everybody you love. But practice in other areas of your life, restraint, self-control, delay gratification, because you are strengthening a pathway in your brain that will allow you to then practice in those big things in your life. So that's what I will think of in terms of practically. And Samson's life could have been different if he did that. His whole life as a Nazarite was that. Don't touch carcasses, don't drink alcohol, keep your hair long. It was about restraining and practicing these things that maybe would have been easier for a child to. I don't know, as children, you ever done that? Even mine now. The other day I was in the car park in my church and there was a bone, and I didn't touch it with my hand, but I was just kicking it with my foot, and these people wouldn't even do that. So you have to be mindful as a Nazarite of it's a vow of remembrance of who you are. So practically speaking, in our everyday life is restrain yourself for certain things that that you fall for.
I have a couple of questions for you, Dan.
Okay.
So one of them that I think might be useful to pick your brains about is, so Samson, as we mentioned, had this problem with seeing a woman, desiring the woman based on what he saw, and going after that, right? So I think it's true that some people have maybe a greater challenge with, say, sexual promiscuity, I guess you would say, than others. So let's say if somebody has that inclination, like Samson did, how would you recommend treating them from a psychological perspective?
Well, there is two things that there's two things that I can think of that come to mind in terms of promiscuity and lust and things like that. Now, we have to think about this. Christian psychology is different from world psychology.
Sure.
You go into a pub, to a bar, to any such place and picking up somebody, having a one-night stand, it's normal today. but we're talking about here about Christian principles,
Yes.
right? So from that perspective, there is two things that come to mind that could play a role, psychologically, psychiatrically speaking. One, when people are bipolar, they come through this manic state. It's called mania. And sometimes people become promiscuous. They just cannot control themselves. That's a true... There's a chemical in the brain that is messing up, and there's receptors that are not active as they should be. And people start doing that. But then they go through it's called manic depression, so they go to a depressive state. I don't see Samson depressed at all in any shape or form, at least not from the limited information we have. And then there is another one, which is histrionic personality disorder. Now, I'm not saying this guy had it, but there is certain characteristics. Somebody histrionic is somebody who is... It can present promiscuous. In promiscuous, when I see somebody, a patient, and I write in my notes, promiscuous presentation is not that they're having sex with me. It's rather the way they're presenting themselves. Over familiarity, very appealing, very conducive to be flirtatious. A womanizer would be a bit like that. Winking to the therapist when it's a nice young lady. It happens a lot. It does happen.
Right.
And some people have this tendency. It doesn't have to be a personality disorder. That's a clinical condition. But there could be traits of that.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you treat that? It goes back to, again, your formation.
Mm-hmm.
So if we just go from the psychological perspective, I will go back to that formation as to why is it in your psychological makeup to be appealing other people's for the sake of that. That's one thing. If we are just talking about satisfying the lust because of the chemical rush, that's an addiction, and then we have to deal with that as an addiction. It's a different treatment altogether. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know if this guy was masturbating, if he was watching porn. I don't know what porn would probably be more like a live thing for these people in theater because there was no media there. We don't know that. What we know is that he liked women, and he probably liked sex because he went to a prostitute.
That's right.
And so he probably had an addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not hard to think that he might have been a womanizer. He might wink to women around, and a lot of people listen to him because he is the strong guy.
Just flex a bit.
Yeah. So there is different ways to treat that, I guess, depending on where it's coming from. The first thing is discover where it comes from.
Mm-hmm. Well, my second question was going to be related to that. I was going to ask. I would have said Samson would have had what I guess you would classify as an addictive personality.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was going to ask about that. So you've kind of just answered that question. But so if somebody felt that maybe they have an addictive personality, does that come back to that practicing self-control? How else could that be managed?
Yeah. I wrote a little booklet on addiction.
Did you?
Yeah, but it's still on edition, and I wish we had it with I don't know if I should say this live, but maybe cut it off if it's not relevant. With the what is it called, that Gary Kent thing, the journey something?
The Incredible Journey.
Yeah. So, and what did I mention that? Because I wish that we had it so we could say like, hey, whoever listens to this thing, just call or send a message on Instagram.
And we'll give it to you.
them. Yeah, that's the reason why.
It makes sense now.
Make it like an it is written thing.
Yeah.
Or no, the Amazing Journey, the Incredible Journey. Addictions. The first step to any addiction, and you might know, I don't know, you might have heard of this, but it's acknowledging that you have a problem.
Right.
And that's the hardest thing.
Yeah.
So I don't know, you're ahead of the stages of change. Have you heard of the stages of change? It's a very clinical model. Prochaska and Di Clemente, the guys who developed this thing. And basically, the first thing is denial. I don't have a problem. There is no issue whatsoever. I'm fine the way I am. I don't see, because we have limited information. We don't know. We could argue because of the Hebrew thing that maybe he battled this dissonance, like, oh, no, I want to do the right thing, but then I fall for my addiction. Or we could argue that because we don't know enough that he didn't even bother. He just kept on falling for it over and over, and he didn't care anymore. But the denial is the first thing.
But if we make the assumption that he is, and so we can sort of work through the process for the sake of learning about
if
it, right?
he is, which one out of the two? If he is...
Denial.
He will be in denial either way. So well, he's in denial. The first thing will be to make him aware. So what do we do to do that? And you do tests, you do interviews, you talk about, hey, has anybody ever talked to you about this before? Has your mom, your dad, your brother, your sister, your wife, your husband, your cousin, your neighbor complain about this? Yeah, they have. Okay. How you feel guilty or shameful after you did whatever you did? Yeah, I have. Okay. And you go through that process of raising awareness.
Okay.
It's a clinical process, really. But the first thing is to make sure that from denial you come to what we call pre-contemplative stage, when you're like, oh, maybe I do. Oh no, it must not be me. And then from there you go to contemplating, and then you go to, oh yeah, I do have it. And from there to wanting to do something, you go back to, do I really want to do something about it or not? So you go through that process, and the key treatment might not mean nothing to you, but it's called motivational interviewing. So you go through a process. What are the costs?
Okay.
What are the costs? How much are you losing by continuing to having this addiction? That's the cognitive therapeutic aspect of, remember what are you losing, and remember the shame, remember the guilt, remember that you're a judge, remember that you're a Nazarite, remember that God saved you for a purpose, remember that you don't have to do this, remember that you can have a beautiful wife and not just going around with prostitutes. All this stuff, it's part of motivational interviewing, which means motivating the patient to try to want to change and actively do something about change. And then once you go through that, it's like, okay, what am I going to do now? Do you have social supports, networks, accountability, and going through, sometimes you need professional help. We all have some element of that. And so Samson could have been good by having somebody helping him through that process, perhaps. And then you move to that time when you need to make sure you don't make, the Bible says it, make no provision for the flesh, right? If I know that I am very weak for this thing, why am I walking through, I don't know, in Australia, is it King's Cross,
Yeah.
those red light areas? No point. Oh, I'm going to evangelize people. I'm going to avenge the Philistines. Like, avenge them during daylight when everybody's watching, and not at nighttime when you are the weakest and the tired and whatever. That's where, and that applies with alcohol, with tobacco, with any other substances, with sexual addictions, the same. Making it hard for you to access things, making it hard for you to see these people, making it hard for you to be able, what at stake is at stake, and that's the reason why you have to see the costs. Because once you see the cost and you accept, the costs are too much, you will do anything to stop it. To stop it. But it's a cognitive exercise. We have to remind ourselves over and over again, because it's easy to forget when the chemical comes of the desire, the hunger for that dopamine rush or endorphin rush or whatever, or oxytocin release. It's hard to not go there.
Yeah, right.
Solomon will be hard, like, oh, I really want that. So that's and the faithful, they pray and all that kind of stuff. But we pray, we do, right? So the execution of practical things. I hope that answered. There's more to that.
That's a good answer.
Yeah, thank you.
That's great. So I'm just throwing it out there. Is there anything else that we need to deal with this one, or are we wrapping this one up?
I'm happy. I think there's some unanswered things, but the limitation of understanding of the story gives us all. It's great, but I think it's a good story. A lot of learnings for sure.
Well,
very practical in our society of see it, want it.
We live in that instant gratification world, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we'll leave that one there. Thank you again for joining us for another episode. We really enjoying this series, so thank you so much for being here with us. And we will leave it there. But if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend, and we look forward to seeing you guys next week.
Thank you.